Thank you for the intro. Thanks for having me today. Especially big thanks to Wamsi for setting all of this up and hosting. I am Karissa. I'm going to talk about threatened marine species and especially sawfish. So, as I said, my name is Karissa. I'm a research fellow at Murdoch University. I work mostly with threatened sharks and rays and other threatened species as well. And today I'm going to give a bit of an overview into how I ended up doing what I'm doing, and then talk about threatened species, what it means to be a threatened species, and go more into sawfish, which are one of my favorites. So as you may have picked up from my accent already, I grew up in the US. I'm from Seattle, up in the northwest corner, and Seattle is surrounded by the ocean. So from a young age, I was kind of always exposed to the ocean and to marine life, and one of my favorite things to do was to search around at low tide and all this smelly seaweed and find out what I could. So I've always had this real interest in marine life and the ocean in general. And so when I went to uni, I knew I wanted to focus on biology, and marine biology wherever I could. And that ended up taking me down to the Turks and Caicos Islands in the Caribbean for a semester abroad. So I lived down there for a few months, and that was the real first time I really came in contact with many sharks and rays, and I was just really taken aback by the diversity of sharks and rays and also their interactions with each other and with other species and the importance that they held in those ecosystems. And I ended up doing some directed research on spotted eagle rays, which, kind of similar to whale sharks or a tiger or a leopard, have unique spot patterns. So each individual has a unique pattern, and you can actually identify individuals through taking photos of them and charting their patterns. And so we were doing that for a while, and we started to see the same individuals kind of show up at the same times or time of day or location, and with the same other individuals, and they had a lot of cool behaviors and interactions with each other, and I got really interested in thinking about what these rays were doing when we weren't in the water looking at them. So we're only there observing them for a blink in their lifetime. What do they do the rest of the time? So I got interested in tagging technology and kind of using electronic techniques to be able to track sharks when you can't observe them. And that took me down after I finished uni to a job in Florida where I was working in a lab studying behavior and physiology of sharks through electronic tagging techniques. So I worked there for a couple years and learned a ton about what you can learn about a shark when you can't see it. So putting tags on with all sorts of activity sensors that show you what a shark is doing when you can't see it, how active it is, where it is in the water column, whether it's swimming up and down or sitting on the bottom. Or put a camera on a shark and be able to see what the shark sees when you can't track the shark around. Or put a satellite tag on a shark and be able to see where that shark goes. So learn a lot about different methods of tagging sharks and rays. And then an opportunity came up to do a PhD here in Perth at Murdoch University. So about 10 years ago, I moved over here and I did my PhD at Murdoch focusing on bull sharks and sawfish up in the Fitzroy River in the Kimberley. And since then, I have stayed on it as a research fellow, and I work a lot with different shark and ray species or other aquatic species using tagging technology or other techniques to kind of figure out where they are and what they're doing and what they need from us to be protected. So that brings us to our main topic of the day, which is threatened species. So we are super lucky to have a lot of threatened species in WA. Well, lucky, not lucky, I guess, but I say lucky because a lot of these threatened species are not doing very well elsewhere in their range, but in WA, their populations are still tend to be doing better than other places due to low fishing pressure and low interactions and lots of still pretty pristine habitat. So first of all, I guess, what is officially a threatened species? The definition is any animal or plant that is at risk of extinction. So they're are all sorts of threatened species that we have in WA, but they're all kind of threatened to different extents. And so we have all of these terms to label to what extent a species is threatened. And at the least threatened end of the spectrum, we have up at the top least concern, and those are species that are not currently facing a threat of extinction in the wild, so their population is stable, they're basically doing okay, and they're the species that we don't need to worry about as much at present. Then we have the near threatened species, so those are animals or plants that do not qualify for a threatened listing status at present, but maybe they've undergone a small decline or are likely to experience a decline, and they're kind of species that we need to keep an eye on to make sure that they don't become threatened. Below that we have the three main threatened species categories. Those are vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. And those are species facing a high, very high, or extremely high risk of extinction in the wild in the medium, near, or immediate future. So basically all those species could certainly become extinct within our lifetimes, and at the critically endangered end of the spectrum could become extinct within the next 5 to 10 years or even shorter periods if conservation and management aren't put in place to protect them. Then below that line, we have the species that are extinct in the wild already, so they're known to survive only in captivity, maybe in a zoo or a conservation park, and animals that are extinct in general, so the last member of the species is known to have died. Below that we have a category called data deficient, where basically it means we're not sure. It usually refers to species that we think might be threatened, but there is not adequate information at present to assess their level of threat. In Australia, we have a couple of other protected species categories as well. The first is conservation dependent, and those are species that are not labeled as threatened currently, but they are dependent on ongoing conservation actions, and if those actions were to stop, they would be likely to become threatened. A good example is the scalloped hammerhead. So that's a species of shark that is fished off several coasts of Australia. And there's tight management regarding how many of them are allowed to be kept. So they're not threatened at present, but if that management was to go away, they would likely become threatened quite quickly. We also have migratory species, and those are species that transit between states and territories or even between countries. A good example is migratory shorebirds. We have a ton of shorebirds here in WA that nest in Asia, in Siberia, Russia, China, and then come down to overwinter during our summer in WA or in other parts of Australia. And so you can imagine that those species are flying through tons of different countries, and they have to rely on being protected or managed by all of those countries altogether. And so they might be exposed to a bunch of different levels of protection or different levels of threat in all those places, and so in generally are probably more vulnerable to threats than species that live in the same place all the time. We also have this other specially protected species category, which basically means they are not threatened or don't qualify for any of the other categories, but they are in need of special protection. And a good example of that is the saltwater crocodile. So crocodiles are not threatened at present, but they are fully protected in Australia, and you can imagine that if they weren't protected in Australia, they might become threatened, given that people don't like having them in their backyards. So that brings us to who gets to decide which species fall into which category. There are a couple different bodies that do this. One of the main ones is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. You guys might have heard of the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. So this is an international organization that looks at the whole global population of a species across all the countries that it occupies, and says, is that global population threatened or stable or whatever? At the national level in Australia, we have the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the EPBC Act, and that one just looks at what's happening within Australia and says, is that population in Australia, regardless of whatever else is going on in the rest of the world, is the Australian population threatened, stable, what's happening with it? And that body is kind of the most important for the legal consequences of threatened species within Australia. At the state level, we have another Biodiversity Conservation Act in Western Australia, and that again just looks even smaller, only at the population in WA. Is that population stable or declining or threatened, or what's happening with it? And those listing statuses from different bodies don't necessarily have to match up. So for example, the giant shovel-nosed ray is a species that was distributed throughout the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia and Australia, and they have undergone major declines throughout most of their range. They've disappeared from places, they've become incredibly rare in places, mostly due to overfishing, and so globally they are labeled as critically endangered. But they're actually doing quite well in Australia. So if you go to the northwest, north of Shark Bay-ish, you are likely to see some of these guys in the shallows. We have very low commercial fishing pressure on them. No directed fisheries. They have a lot of habitat in protected areas. So they are actually doing quite well, and they are not listed at all in Australia. They're considered least concern. So how do all of these bodies decide which species get listed? It's actually quite a regimented process that species has to go through rigorous scientific assessment to determine if they're threatened and what level of threat they're at. And it's mostly based on criteria related to whether they've experienced a decline in their extent of occurrence or area of occupancy, so basically the amount of space that they live in. A decline in population size, so the total number of species, total number of animals within a population, has that declined? Maybe it's a species that originally had a very small population or very small habitat, and they still occupy that small habitat, but they are more susceptible to threats because there are not very many of them to start out with. Or a species that are likely to undergo further declines in area or population. So a couple different things can qualify a species as threatened. As an example, let's look at the short-nosed sea snake, which is an endemic species we have here in WA. They were proposed for a threatened listing status a couple of years ago, and at the time it was estimated that they had undergone a population decline of at least 90%. So if we look at this table here, a population decline of 90% puts them in the critically endangered, very severe population reduction category. So these guys under that criteria qualify as critically endangered. If we look at their area of occupancy, it was estimated that they occurred in less than 250 square kilometers total of space. So basically they have this patch of ocean that's less than 250 kilometers squared, or multiple patches, and that is the only place that they live. So if we look at the area of occupancy criteria down here, it's 250 is bigger than 10, so they don't qualify for critically endangered there, but it's less than 500, so they end up in this endangered restricted area of occurrence category. And it's actually fairly common for species to qualify in different status in different categories, and in that case we take the most threatened of them. So this species overall is listed as critically endangered. So why does it matter whether species get listed as threatened or protected in WA or in Australia overall? Basically, they get more protection when they are listed as a protected or threatened species. And the way that can work, one of the most important things for marine species that are listed as threatened and protected is that they are not allowed to be retained in commercial or recreational fisheries. And also if a commercial fishery has an interaction with one, so maybe they accidentally catch a sea turtle or a sawfish or a dolphin as bycatch, they have to report that interaction to the government when they report all of their fisheries catches. So it kind of enables us to keep a lot better track of where certain species occur, where they're interacting with fisheries, whether those interactions are above a level that constitutes, a major threat. Another one of the protections that threatened species have is that if there's any development, say a shoreline development or other coastal developments or an offshore oil and gas platform, if that development is proposed in an area where a threatened species occurs, the effects of that development on the threatened species need to be taken into account, and they can go through a big sort of legal government process of ensuring that that development will not affect the health or persistence of that species in the area. Threatened and protected species also in general have a lot more resources or funding available for researchers or government bodies to learn about them, or to develop recovery plans or threat abatement plans or conservation advice, or just in general to do research on those species that tells us more about where they are, what they're doing in certain habitats, what habitats are important, basically learning what we need to know to be able to protect them. So we have a lot of different threatened species in WA, as I said, which is pretty cool. There are 6 species of sea turtles in Australia, all of which are listed as either vulnerable or endangered. They're threatened by things like plastic pollution in this photo, but also sea turtles are one of those marine species that come onto land to nest. They're also, and their nesting sites are often threatened by habitat destruction or climate change, or light pollution is a big one. Feral predators like foxes digging up turtle nests is also a major threat. They're also threatened by boat strike. They spend a lot of the time at the surface, or by interactions with commercial fisheries or entanglement in fishing gear. So lots of different things going on. We also have tons of different marine mammals in WA, several dolphin species, a few of which are listed as threatened, many whales, sea lions, fur seals, dugongs. So all marine mammals are fully protected in Australia, even some under threatened listing status, many under migratory, and others just under the listing cetacean, which basically means they're a marine mammal and they're protected. Some of the main threats are entanglement in fishing gear, either active fishing gear or old fishing gear, or trash or something that's been left behind in the ocean. Underwater noise can also be a big threat to marine mammals, as they use sound to communicate with each other, to find their food, to find their way around. Underwater sound is really important to them, and sometimes when large amounts of human sound, like from boats or seismic surveys or wind farms or things like that, sort of infiltrate the marine environment, they can cover up that biological sound and really threaten marine mammals. They're also threatened by things like boat strike, or, since they spend a lot of time at the surface, or fisheries interactions, or climate change changing where their food occurs, especially for filter feeding whales. As I said before, also, we're very lucky to have tons of different seabird species in WA, a lot of which are listed as threatened and many of which are listed as migratory. One of the main threats to seabirds is during their nesting periods, because just like turtles, they come on land to nest, and so they're subject to terrestrial threats, especially feral cats, dogs, foxes disturbing or eating their nesting habitats, or habitat destruction of their nesting habitats. A lot of them nest in very specific locations or habitats. Human disturbance of nesting habitats from four-wheel driving or even walking your dog past the nest can also be a major threat to them, as are plastic pollution and other types of pollution, and sometimes interactions in commercial fisheries depending on the species, so lots of different things going on there as well. We're also lucky to have quite a few different sea snake species in WA, including a few threatened ones. The major threat to sea snakes is through trawl fishing, so they're highly susceptible to being caught in commercial trawl fisheries for prawns or fish, and they don't tend to do very well once caught. So yeah, that's their major threat, and they can also be threatened by boat strikes. They spend a lot of time at the surface, and habitat destruction. So some of them, rely on very specific habitats, like coral reefs or seagrass or mangrove areas that are susceptible to destruction. We have a few fish species listed in WA. Over here, this blue warrahoo in the top corner is one of the only sort of fishy fish species, fish-shaped fish species in WA, and that's a conservation-dependent species that's involved in the fisheries down south. But also in Australia, all seahorses and pipefish are listed, and that is mostly to prevent them from being collected and traded in the aquarium trade or in medicine trade, and they can also be threatened by habitat destruction. A lot of them rely on very specific habitats, kind of like sea snakes, so specific types of coral or seagrass that become under threat. We have a couple of threatened sharks in WA, including white sharks, grey nurse sharks, whale sharks, and 2 species of river shark up in the north, the northern river shark and the speartooth shark. And so those species are mostly threatened by commercial fishing interactions. Whale sharks are also threatened a lot by boat strike and plastic pollution as a filter feeder. Other species can be threatened by climate change, changing where their prey ends up, or habitat destruction if they rely on certain areas. So again, a few interacting threats. And then we have the sawfish, which we're going to talk much more about. Sawfish are a species of ray. They have their gills on the bottom rather of their bodies rather than the sides, which is how you know they're a ray. There are a few other ray species in WA that are protected as migratory, but sawfish are the main ones with a threatened listing status. There are 4 species listed in WA. So let's talk more about those because they're my special favorites. So first, what is a sawfish? Hopefully some of you guys have had the chance to see one in real life, but sawfish are large shark-like rays, and they're distinguished by this super toothy long snout called a rostrum. And if you think that they look weird like old dinosaurs, you would be correct. Sawfish has a body shape, have been around for about 100 million years, which means that they were swimming around in the ocean while our favorite dinosaurs were roaming the land. The modern family of sawfishes is about 60 million years old, so not quite the same, but also pretty impressive given that humans, for example, have only been around for about 2 million years. Sawfish are also huge, so several species can grow to over 6 meters, which is quite impressive. They're one of the larger fish species out there. About a third of their body is this rostrum, that toothy snout. So let's think about what it is used for, if I can get my video to play. This is a video I took of a sawfish I had in a tank during my PhD for a little while. And one of the main purposes of the rostrum is to catch fish. So sawfish in the wild will go into a school of fish and swipe their rostrum back and forth and to stun their prey so they can shoot them into their mouth. Sawfish also use the rostrum as protection. The first, instinct of a sawfish, if you catch it, is to give you a little whack to tell it to let go. And sawfish also have similar to sharks, if you guys have heard of a shark's sixth sense, they have these jelly-filled electroreception pores that sharks usually have all over their mouth. Sawfish have them all the way down their rostrum, and they use those pores to sense heartbeats of prey, so they can help sawfish to find prey in murky water or in the mud. Some of the global threats to sawfish are commercial fishing. So you can imagine that the rostrum, being a cool multi-use tool for the sawfish, also gets it into quite a bit of trouble when there is nets or lines and stuff in the water. So globally, they're not doing super well. And the biggest threat is commercial fishing. So being caught in nets or by lines, or entanglement in gear that's been left behind. They're in a few places still targeted for their fins and meats, but often are just caught as bycatch, accidental catch. but they're very hard to remove from fishing gear. Sometimes the rostra are also taken off as trophies, like this one down here. You can see this sawfish we caught in Northwest with a rostrum removed that had been previously removed. So the rostrum, as I said, is very important for them to find food and for protection, and without it they will likely die from starvation. They are also threatened by habitat loss, especially juveniles that use coastal nursery areas, which we'll talk more about in a bit, and from climate change. That's the same thing, disturbing those coastal nursery areas or messing with the currents and prey availability and things like that. Sawfish also have quite a vulnerable life history, which means that they have biological characteristics that make it hard for them to recover from population declines and things like that. They live a long time, they get very large, they grow very slowly, so it takes most species at least 7 to 10 years to reach maturity, which is quite a long time to be swimming around in the ocean trying to avoid getting caught by a net. They also have low fecundity, which means that they don't have very many offspring, not many babies. So most sawfish species will have about 2 to 15 pups every 2 years or so. So it makes it really hard for them to recover from population declines if there's mortality in some other portion of the population. And that's opposed to, say, a fish, which might be able to have 1 million or millions of babies within their lifetime. And be able to kind of recover that population much quicker. So those vulnerable life history characteristics, slow growth, long time to maturity, not many offspring, are often shared by a lot of threatened species. For example, dolphins may only have 1 baby every couple of years, and it takes a long time for that baby to get to the age where they're having their own babies. So those are a lot of threatened species have those sorts of characteristics. For sawfish, it is basically all of those threats, especially commercial fishing, combined with those life history characteristics, have made them go through severe declines globally. So this map is of the historical distribution of the large-toothed or freshwater sawfish, and the yellow bits are where they are still currently found. So this species used to be distributed all across the tropics in the shallows, but they've been lost from much of the eastern Pacific, from a lot of the Atlantic as well, just remaining in a few little pockets there, and lost from a lot of Africa, and they are mostly now in northern Australia and in some parts of southern and Southeast Asia, as well as some bits of South and Central America. So that's kind of story is similar across all sawfish species, and as a result, all 5 species globally are listed as critically endangered by the IUCN. But here in WA, they're doing better compared to many other places, at least. We are lucky enough to have 4 of the world's 5 sawfish species in WA, including the green sawfish, the dwarf sawfish, the narrow sawfish, and the freshwater sawfish, all of which live up in the northwest and across the other northern bits of Australia. As I said before, all 4 species are globally listed as critically endangered, but in Australia they're only listed as vulnerable for green dwarf and freshwater sawfish, and then all 4 are listed as migratory, and narrow sawfish don't currently have a threatened listing. So comparatively to other parts of their range, they are doing much better, though they are still actively under threat here in WA and across Australia. The green sawfish spans mostly from Shark Bay to the north. The dwarf sawfish is the most northern, that spans from about Port Hedland to the north, and the freshwater and narrow sawfish both span from about Exmouth Gulf northward. So they're all up there in the northwest. And we're also pretty lucky to have some really globally important nursery habitats for them in WA. So that term nursery area basically means the mums will come and drop their pups in a protected, sheltered area that is safer for the pups to grow up in compared to being in the open ocean. So sawfish use a couple of different coastal areas as nursery habitats depending on the species. And because mums are philopatric, it means that they are going to return to their own nursery area to give birth to their pups, similar to, say, a sea turtle returning to the beach it was born at to lay its eggs. So it means it's really important that we keep protecting those specific nursery habitats because we know they're going to continue to be used across generations. So some of the really important nursery habitats we have in WA are up in the Fitzroy River near Derby and Broome. So the freshwater sawfish, as its name suggests, is the only species that uses fully freshwater areas as a nursery. So their mums come and drop their pups at the mouth of rivers, and the pups swim upriver to the fully freshwater, sometimes spend 4 to 6 years, several hundred kilometers from the ocean before they get to about 2.5 meters and get too big for the river and swim back. So the Fitzroy River out of Derby is globally one of the only places that we know about that this species pups regularly, and that a lot of pups are found there, a lot of juveniles are found there. So globally it's the only kind of intact nursery habitat we know about for that species. So very important for the persistence of that species as a whole. We also have another really important nursery for dwarf sawfish up in the same area. So unlike freshwater sawfish, dwarf sawfish don't like the fully freshwater, but they do like sitting around in estuaries where the freshwater meets the ocean and there's that brackish low salinity area. And dwarf sawfish use the estuaries as their nursery. And the King Sound, again, is kind of the only regularly used important dwarf sawfish nursery we know about in much of the world. So again, it's really important for the kind of global persistence of that species. We also have some important nursery habitats for green sawfish. So unlike the previous two sawfish, they are fully marine, including during juvenile phases. They don't like fresh or brackish water, and they use shallow mangrove creeks or river mouths which are not flowing in the Pilbara, like the Ashburton, or tidal creeks for their nursery areas, so these shallow tidal protected areas. And there's a really important nursery in the Ashburton River and surrounding area near Onslow, and it's likely that a lot of the other Pilbara coast and up into the Kimberley holds important nursery habitats for green sawfish as well, that again are some of the only sort of regularly used by a lot of sawfish type nursery habitats for the species we know about in the world. So it's extremely cool that we have all those nurseries in WA. And it is really important that we keep it that way. So some of the work that I do and other members of my team and other researchers look into is just basically learning more about what sawfish do so we know how to protect them. So some of the techniques that we use include just catching sawfish in a net and using conventional tagging, these ID tags, so we can track individuals across years. That tells us more about sort of where sawfish are found, and are they juveniles or adults found there, or how many pups are coming in each year. So we can look at things like that. We can also use electronic tagging techniques to learn more about what sawfish are doing and where they're going. That tells us a lot about what type of habitat sawfish need, how long do they spend in a nursery area, what areas do we need to focus on protecting, what areas do they use for feeding, for example, or refuging. So we can learn a lot about what the needs of sawfish are using that types of technology. There are other groups as well that are using genetics to study sawfish, so looking at population connectivity. Are the populations we have here in WA connected to those in the Northern Territory or Indonesia or elsewhere, or are they their own separate entity? Looking at fisheries interactions, all those reported interactions of bycatch can also provide a lot of information about sort of general population trends of sawfish and where adult sawfish are hanging out. So lots of different techniques to learn as much as we can about sawfish to make sure that we understand how to keep WA this hotspot and this sort of safe haven for sawfish and globally. So that is all I have today. I want to quickly thank lots of people who help with the research I just talked about from lots of different funding bodies and ranger groups. And thanks again to WAMSI for putting this all together. I thank you guys for listening, for hosting me in Geraldton, and hopefully you have a couple of questions. Yeah, thank you.